Today he was up in Jamestown, interviewed by Mr. Greg Peterson. Wonderful conversation there. We were fortunate to have him here. Value the ability to partner with other organizations that like to provide educational opportunities, not just for the cities that they serve, but the regions that they serve. And we have a great partner in the Jackson Center. We look forward to continuing to partner with them on many events to come. Dr. Weinberg is the William Rand Kennan Jr. Professor Emeritus of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he's been a member of the faculty since 1974. He received his doctorate and his master's degree from the University of Chicago, and he is regarded throughout the world as one of the foremost leading scholars in World War II. He's published many, many books, including Visions of Victory, The Hopes of 8 World War II Leaders, part of tonight's topic. Also, Hitler's Foreign Policy, The Road to World War II, A World at Arms, Global History of World War II, and The World in Balance. Plenty of other amazing accomplishments. I could stand up here all night, but you're not here to hear from me, you're here to hear from Dr. Weinberg. So without further ado, please join me in issuing a very warm Jefferson welcome for Dr. Weinberg.
We live in a constantly changing world. Since 1945, many borders have been altered. This talk derives from a project to illuminate the visions of the future of 8 World War II leaders. How did they see the world after the war, assuming of course that they had won? Drawn from this project is an effort to see how they expected to draw the boundaries of the post-war world. Since he initiated the war, I'll start with Adolf Hitler. One preliminary remark must be made before one can intelligently examine Hitler's views during the war. As he had explained already in his second book in 1928, each war provided only the starting point for the next war. Areas conquered for settlement would make it possible to replace the local population with German agrarian settlers whose numerous offspring would both replace the casualties incurred in the fighting to conquer that land and also make necessary and possible the next conquest. What was to happen when the German settlers met on the other side of the globe was not explained any more than the Marxists explained what would happen when the state had withered away. It must be understood, therefore, that the boundaries planned for the end of World War II have to be seen as provisional ones in Hitler's eyes. They would be replaced by more extensive ones after subsequent wars. Let's turn now to Germany's intended borders after victory in World War II. In the north, Norway and Finland were certain to be annexed, with Denmark and Sweden almost certainly destined to follow. In the west, Luxembourg was already annexed during the war. Holland and large parts of Belgium and France were also to be annexed. A German occupation of all of Great Britain, including all of Ireland, was planned. Whether this was to be a prelude to annexation or to some sort of satellite state is not clear. Switzerland was to be partitioned with 3 quarters going to Germany and the southeastern quarter being incorporated into Italy. In Southeast Europe, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were to be under German domination, while Yugoslavia and Greece would be partitioned with Italy. In the east, all lands to the Urals would be annexed to Germany, that in the future would get its oil from the Caucasus, the oil of the Middle East was intended for Italy, a subject I'll return to. Germany's colonial conquest was to be in Africa, was to be divided into three parts. The northern part would be Italy's, this area, but with German bases off the coast here. Germany would take over a broad swath of Central Africa, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, all of this. This would include the former German colonies there, but also those of France, Britain, and Belgium, together with the northern portions of the Portuguese colonies. The southern part of the continent would be ruled by an Afrikaner regime allied with Germany. The future of German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, was not entirely settled. Most likely it would have gone back to Germany, with the Union of South Africa compensated by the annexation of the former British protectorates of Bechuanaland, Swaziland, and Zululand, and the southern parts of the Portuguese colonial empire. There were different ideas within the German government about the partition of Asia with Japan. In spite of the recommendation of the High Command of the German Armed Forces that Germany should control Central Siberia, but not take Afghanistan or any part of India, Hitler agreed to the Japanese proposal of a partition at the 70th degree longitude. With this line, Germany would acquire Afghanistan and what is now Pakistan. The German diplomats in Tokyo had, without fully informing Berlin, agreed to the turning over to Japan of all German former colonies in the Pacific. But even without this problem, there were enough difficulties in German-Japanese relations to assure lots of friction in the post-war era. It is not clear from the sources just how the German government saw the future of North America. In Imperial Germany, there had been a lengthy argument over whether the conquest of North America should begin with a landing on the coast of Cape Cod or the coast of Long Island. But the Second Empire possessed a large navy, while the Third Reich had first to build one. In his second book, Hitler had explained that preparing for war with the United States would be a most important task of a National Socialist government. It was therefore entirely consistent that as soon as the weapons systems needed for war with Britain and France were well along with the production in 1937, he ordered in that year both the building of super battleships for war with the United States and the designing and building of intercontinental bombers, sometimes called America bombers, sometimes called New York bombers, by the German aircraft industry. Although a great deal of work had been done on these projects, September 39 was too soon, neither was ready. Plenty of time for detailed planning. The plans for Latin America had also not progressed very far. It is not clear just how the large communities of German background in South America would fit into German plans. Furthermore, there is, as far as I know, simply no evidence as to whether Hitler was informed about the planning in Nazi party circles about Patagonia, the southernmost portion of Argentina. It was in any case clear that in regard to Central and South America, as with regard to Asia, there would need to be some arrangement with Japan. I shall return to Japanese views on this matter subsequently. In the meantime, the German government had to concentrate on the need for a blue water navy and an intercontinental bomber. It is no coincidence that after the German victories in the West in the summer of 1940, and after the German assumption of victory in the East in the summer of 1941, the first new set of directives to come out of Hitler's headquarters was for the resumption of construction on the huge fleet that would deal with the American Navy. Turn to Mussolini. Most of Italy's planned annexations have already been mentioned. In addition to a part of Switzerland, Mussolini expected to take the island of Corsica and substantial portions of France, major parts of Yugoslavia, a satellite state in Croatia, and parts of Greece. Perhaps the whole country would, along with an already enlarged Albania, provide a coherent Italian state from Fiume to the Dodecanese Islands in the Aegean. The future of Turkey was, as far as I can discover, not settled between the Axis powers. But Mussolini certainly hoped to include it in Italy's domain. In any case, all of French North and Northwest Africa would become Italian, as would Egypt and the Sudan. The British and French portions of Somalia, as well as Kenya, would round out Italy's already existing colonial empire in Northeast Africa. Furthermore, a most important addition to Italy's empire was contemplated. The bulk of the Middle East would be under Italian control. It was from this region that Italy would draw its oil supplies while the Germans obtained theirs from the Caucasus, and they could take it from this area, the Middle East, after all Jews there had been killed. Let me turn to Tojo Hideki. When we turn to Japan, there is a serious problem. When we examine the record of Tojo, we are faced with the fact that the literature on the central figure in the Japanese government from October 1941 to July 1944 focuses on his role in Japan's decision to attack the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, his fall from power in July 1944, and his failed suicide attempt and his trial before the War Crimes Trial in 1945. In spite of his central role in the first years of the war in the Pacific, neither Japanese historians nor those of other countries have examined in any detail his actions, hopes, and policies during that critical time. But because Tojo was not only Prime Minister, but also insisted on holding on to the Ministry of War that he had taken over in July 41 and directed with an iron hand thereafter, the planning that did take place there surely gives us some indication of his thinking. Certainly Tojo's well-deserved reputation as a stickler for detail, very hard worker, and inclined to deal ruthlessly with any in the bureaucracy with ideas contrary to his own, make it singularly unlikely that the plans made in the War Ministry were thought by those who made them as anything other than reflections of their master's concepts. According to the War Ministry planning in the winter of 1941-42, Japan would not only control Korea, China, the Philippines, and the already conquered or soon to be conquered islands in the Central and South Pacific. In addition, Australia, New Zealand, Ceylon, Hawaii, Alaska, most of India, the provinces and territories of Western Canada, the state of Washington, all of Central America, Colombia, the western part of Venezuela, Ecuador, all the islands in the Caribbean were to go to Japan. In South America, there were major areas as well, and of course, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and so on. They planned to purchase from Portugal the portions of Timor and the place of Macau, in other words, bits of the Portuguese colonial empire. What I think one might well call monarchies under Japanese control were to be established in the Dutch and British parts of Indonesia, in Malaya, Burma, enlarged at the expense of India, Thailand, Assam, and Cambodia. As I already mentioned, the Tojo government expected that most of India and the eastern half of the Asian portion of the Soviet Union would also be allocated to Japan. Quite a good size, eh? Let me turn to Chiang Kai-shek. When compared with the rather extravagant ambitions of the Tojo regime, the ambitions of the nationalist government of China under Chiang Kai-shek were quite modest. Chiang took it for granted that all parts of China, and especially Manchuria, that had been seized by Japan would be returned to full Chinese control. He also expected that the territories taken by Japan in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, and this especially meant, Formosa, as Taiwan was then called, would also return to Chinese control, a point on which he had the support of Roosevelt and Churchill. Chiang hoped that Hong Kong would be returned to China before the date specified by treaty. But on this, Churchill was of a very different view, a subject to which I will return. There are substantial indications that Chiang had ambitions that reached further. As an internationally recognized great power, a point on which Roosevelt was particularly insistent, China could hope to exercise considerable influence on a restored independent Korea and on the states that were expected to emerge as independent entities out of French Indochina. Chiang was not interested in playing a major role in the occupation of Japan, but it appears to have been assumed that there would be a Chinese participation in a temporary occupation, most likely the island of Shikoku. In this regard, as in many others, the development in East Asia would move in very different directions, even though China was one of the war's victory. Charles de Gaulle. Of the powers and leaders allied with China, I will turn first to Charles de Gaulle's France. Many of the records are still not accessible. A student of mine who wanted to examine the Free French leader's wartime papers received a polite but definite refusal from his son. There are, however, some fairly clear indications from available records and other materials. De Gaulle assumed, as a matter of course, that all of the pre-war French colonies and possessions would be returned to her, in spite of the promise to the people of Syria that the mandate would be replaced by independence. De Gaulle retained a firm adherence to the opposite view. The artillery bombardment of Damascus would shatter all illusions in this regard. De Gaulle further appears to have entertained hopes for an expansion of the prior French colonial empire. There are clear signs that he hoped to annex the southern part of the Italian colony of Libya to the adjacent French colonies. In other words, this area was to be annexed to French Equatorial Africa. This has nothing to do with the discovery of oil in Libya, something that would occur much later. It is simply a traditional view of war. The loser yields territory to the winner. In my opinion, the attempt of de Gaulle to annex the Val d'Aosta in northwest Italy to France has to be seen in the same context. The France of 1939 was no more in need of additional glaciers than it was of African desert. On the Val d'Aosta issue, de Gaulle would run into an exceedingly bitter confrontation with the new American president, Harry Truman, in 1945. One can, however, safely assume that Roosevelt would have adopted the same stance as Truman. It is not clear from the accessible record whether de Gaulle thought of expanding French Somaliland at the expense of adjacent Italian Eritrea in this area here. Similarly, it is not certain, but most probable, that he would have required the return to French Indochina of the portions that colony ceded to Thailand during the war. As regards Germany, de Gaulle's views during and right after the war were entirely different from the way they would develop in subsequent years. Like his Western allies, he thought of the incorporation of the Saar territory into the French economic sphere. Beyond that, a new unit of some type was to be created in Germany's industrial Ruhr area and the left bank of the Rhine, including Cologne. This was to be a state separate from Germany and in some way under French influence. He was also in favor of some sort of a confederation of 6 of the German states, of which Baden-Württemberg would be aligned with France. France would take a part in the occupation of Germany and utilize its position to preclude the creation of any new German central government. We now come to Stalin's position. Here too, there are serious problems with the sources. As the late General Dmitriev Volkogonov assured me in 1991, the detailed, regular record of Stalin's decisions that either Stalin's private secretary, Poskrebyshev, or subordinate of the latter must have kept, was either destroyed or placed in a spot where no one has been able to find it. There are, however, records kept by others and a series of decisions that Stalin made and are known. We know that in the winter war against Finland, 1939-40, the Red Army, occupied the area around Petsamo, including Finland's only port on the Arctic Ocean, as well as the nickel mines. We're talking about this area here in the very top. In the peace of March 1940, almost all of this territory was returned to Finland. Only the western bit of the Ribachi Peninsula was retained by the Soviet Union. Once Finland joined Germany in war against the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin insisted in all his conversations with the Western Allies that the Petsamo area would have to be annexed to the Soviet Union. When he held it, he gave it up. When he did not have it, he insisted on obtaining it. At a time when he still hoped to stay out of the war, he was prepared to help the Germans conquer Norway, but wanted no common border in the north with Norway or Germany. Once Germany had attacked this country, he was willing to do his allies the favor of allowing Finland to remain independent, but without a port on the Arctic Ocean. The other borders with Finland, on the other hand, would be essentially those of the March 1940 treaty. The western border of the Soviet Union was also to be returned to that of June 41 with two significant exceptions. In addition to the 1940 annexation of the three Baltic states during the first part of the fighting on the Eastern Front, Stalin wanted to annex a small portion of former German East Prussia. This was the city of Tilsit, now called Sovietsk. Since the middle area was in any case to be incorporated into the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, as indeed it was, it may be assumed that this addition was also go to the Lithuanian SSR. Most of East Prussia, including its main city and port of Königsberg, was to be annexed to Poland. During the war, Stalin changed his mind and demanded the northern half of East Prussia. Poland was to be compensated for the loss of Königsberg by the annexation of Stettin on the western side of the Oder River, that is, at Germany's expense. It's my opinion that this was Stalin's response to the policy of Roosevelt that the latter had also forced onto the British of not recognizing the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Under these circumstances, Stalin wanted to be absolutely sure the part of East Prussia annexed to the Soviet Union was not to be incorporated into the Lithuanian SSR, but rather became an oblast, a province of the Russian Federated Soviet Republic. And the territory under the name of Kaliningrad Oblast is still a part of the Russian Federation today. In this fashion, this land was to become a staple, holding the Baltic states under Soviet control. Whether or not this explanation is correct, the arrangement of the border has survived the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The second exception to the western border was to be the one with Poland. Here Stalin made concessions to Poland at the northern and southern end of the Soviet-German line that had divided Poland in 1939. Although Stalin would not agree to Roosevelt's repeated requests that Lviv or Limburg, whatever you want to call the city, be returned to Poland, Stalin was willing to make some concessions, especially in the area around Białystok, but these concessions were to go to a new communist government for Poland of Stalin's creation, A new government, along with a new army, also formed in the Soviet Union. It was to this region that the southern half of East Prussia and all German lands east of the Oder and western Neisse River, plus Stettin as compensation for Königsberg, were to be turned over, and without their German inhabitants. The former free city of Danzig, which had belonged to Poland until 1793, is also to be returned to that state. The incorporation of Galicia from Poland into the Soviet Union would for the first time provide the Soviet Union with a common border with a revived Czechoslovakia that was expected to arise out of Germany's defeat. This country was expected to cede its easternmost portion, Ruthenia or Carpathic Ukraine, to the Soviet Union. As far as one can tell, this annexation of portion of the territory of an ally had two important advantages from Stalin's perspective. In the first place, it would provide a barrier to any strivings for independence among Ukrainians by incorporating the one remaining outside area with substantial Ukrainian population within the USSR. Secondly, the annexation made for a major change in the political and strategic situation in Southeast Europe. The Soviet Union would hereafter have a common border with Hungary and would control passes through the Carpathian Mountains. From the perspective of Czechoslovakia, this painful loss of territory could be seen as averting an even more drastic loss. The Soviet regime had been the only one on earth other than the Axis powers that had recognized the supposed independence of the puppet state of Slovakia created by the Germans in 1939. In the first place, this action had shown that the Soviet Union had no interest whatever in the territorial integrity of Czechoslovakia. In the future, it opened up the possibility that Slovakia might follow the Baltic states into the Soviet Union as an additional socialist Soviet republic. In Southeast Europe, Stalin expected to regain the territory taken from Romania in 1940, as well as the Danube Islands seized by the Red Army. But his ambitions and plans went beyond the 1941 situation. He hoped that the cession of the port of Alexandroupolis by Greece, well, let's see, I think here we better get the other map. Right here. Would provide the Soviet Union with a port on the northern coast of the Aegean Sea. He expected Turkey to yield bases on the straits and a large part of northeastern Turkey as well. Iran was to give up its northwestern provinces to the Soviet Union. It is all too often forgotten that it was to a large extent these aspirations of Stalin that played a major role in the beginning of the Cold War. One should also mention Stalin's request for bases on Spitsbergen and a mandate for a portion of Italian North Africa. We now have to turn to the far east. The long-range plans of Stalin in this direction are difficult to unravel. To what extent he expected to obtain and keep control of Manchuria is hard to discern, as is the possibility that he changed his mind about this during the latter part of the war. In any case, the Liaodong Peninsula with Dairen and Port Arthur was to go to the Soviet Union. Beyond the annexation of the Kuril Islands and the return of the southern half of Sakhalin, both agreed to by Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin appears to have had further ambitions. The occupation, annexation, and expulsion of all Japanese inhabitants of several tiny islands off the northern coast of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, that had belonged to Japan in the past, an issue that still roils relations between Russia and Japan, is difficult to understand unless there were originally plans beyond this that looked to further expansion. Whether these plans included the annexation of Hokkaido is not clear. In any case, that island would have been in the Soviet zone of Japan if Japan, like Germany, had fought to the bitter end, and again, like Germany, was divided into zones of occupation. Now it's time to Winston Churchill. When we turn to Churchill, we see that he never had the slightest doubt that all British colonies that had at any time or by any means been occupied by the Allied Axis powers would be returned to British control along with the Channel Islands. This expectation influenced his view of the last stages of the war in the Pacific. He wanted to go beyond warding off all the hopes of John and Roosevelt for an end of the colonial system. His hopes went beyond the restoration of the status quo ante. He wanted the mandates annexed to Britain, as well as other powers. At the end of World War I, they were now to convert it into colonial possessions, just the opposite of Roosevelt's view. Beyond this, at least one spot, Churchill wanted to expand Britain's colonial empire. An expansion, in other words, not a contraction of colonies. And the possibility, this fits with his general approval of the colonial system, that he countered most sharply all American doubts about the restoration of French and Dutch colonial empires, and that Churchill favored American annexation of islands in the Pacific allocated to Japan after World War I. I'll come back to this issue. As for boundaries in Europe, he had no objection to the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states. Only Roosevelt's pressure had kept him from extending formal recognition. As long as Finland remained independent, he was not interested in the details of its borders. He hoped for an eastern border of Poland that was not very far from the one I've described, although like Roosevelt, he would have preferred for Poland to keep a bit more of its pre-1939 lands. Like his allies, he had been persuaded by the stupid interwar propaganda of the Germans that East Prussia should never be returned to Germany. In fact, this would be the only point on which the three major allies agreed during the war on the position they would instruct their delegates to follow at the peace conference, then expected to follow soon after the victory of the Allies. As regards Germany itself, he would rather have seen Poland move not quite so far to the west. Like Roosevelt, and I'll come back to this shortly, Churchill preferred an economic reorientation of Germany along the lines Henry Morgenthau recommended. A relatively high standard of living like Holland and Denmark, but without heavy industry. Churchill's repeatedly utilized expression was, quote, fat but impotent. This, however, would be feasible only if Germany were allowed to retain most of its agrarian lands in the east. If these were taken away by the imposition of the Oder-Neisse line, the project could not be implemented. The concept, to utilize the terminology of the time, was too soft, not too hard on the Germans. Stalin's opposition and insistence on the Oder-Neisse line rendered it impossible. On Germany's western border, Churchill has already mentioned the detaching of the Saar and turning it over to France. He had a division of Germany into occupation zones drafted that placed Berlin, which was to be ruled jointly by the Allies, into the middle of the Soviet zone. In any case, England was to have the northwestern zone, and early on he expected that there would be a French zone of occupation as well. Since Roosevelt's plans were entirely different, Churchill had his plan for the division between East and West presented in the European Advisory Commission, where it was immediately accepted by the Soviets, who considered this the only intelligent idea Churchill ever had. And he proposed this, I should insert, because he was afraid that Stalin would halt the Red Army at the 1941 border and tell the Brits and Americans, we've done our share, it's your turn. He wanted to make sure that the Soviets had an objective in Central Europe that they would wish to continue to fight for. After Stalin immediately agreed to Churchill's plans, the two powers worked to bring the Americans around. It was assumed that there would be a British zone of occupation in Japan if the Japanese followed the German example of fighting until the whole country, or practically the whole country, was occupied during hostilities. Now we come to Franklin Roosevelt. The hopes of the American president were in many ways different from those of his allies. He did not want the United States to annex any territory whatever. The Philippines were to become independent in accordance with legislation he had himself signed before the war. Against the advice of his chiefs of staff, he saw the islands conquered from the Japanese as under trusteeship, a new form of the post-World War I mandate system. Furthermore, he envisioned a direction for the European colonial empire was the exact opposite of that advocated by Churchill. All other colonies were to become trust territories on the road to independence. There would be no colonial empire in the future at all. And even if Roosevelt, especially in regard to India, did not push Churchill too hard, as Churchill threatened to resign, his own views were and remain entirely clear. Italy's former colonies were also under no circumstances to be incorporated into the colonial empires of other countries. They too would move through the trusteeship category toward independence. Like Churchill, he believed that Yugoslavia should obtain some territorial concessions from Italy and that the Dodecanese Islands were to go to Greece. But in other respects, his views about the future arrangement of Europe were quite different. He had refused to recognize the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union and had restrained the British government from doing so by massive pressure. As already mentioned, he hoped and tried until the last moment to secure some additional territory, especially the city of Lvov for Poland. Like Churchill, he would have preferred an economic reorientation for Germany toward agriculture. But like Churchill, he had to abandon this idea in the face of Stalin's insistence on the Oder-Neisse line. He had his own views on the division of Germany into zones, and these differed fundamentally from Churchill's. Already in 1942, he had commented that American soldiers should be first into Berlin. The division into zones that he prepared in 1943 provided that the eastern and western zones would meet in Berlin. The American zone of occupation was to be in northwest Germany. The memory of American troops isolated in the Philippines was a terrible one, and he did not want an American force to have to depend on communication across a possibly chaotic France. In the face of Anglo-Soviet agreement on an East-West division, he eventually agreed to that line after lengthy negotiations in 1944, accepted the southern zone when the British ceded a special enclave around Bremen and Bremerhaven and an American-controlled railway connection from there to the American zone. He also agreed to one further change in the beginning of 45, a French zone of occupation that at Stalin's insistence was to be carved out of the western zones. A special arrangement was to be made for Berlin, but the details of this were not worked out until after Roosevelt's death. The Allies agreed in 1943 that Austria would be reestablished as an independent state in the borders of 1938. It was also agreed in Roosevelt's lifetime that it would be divided into 4 zones of occupation with a special arrangement for Vienna. Albania was also to retain its independence. At the Cairo conference, Roosevelt had promised Chiang Kai-shek that all territories taken by Japan would be returned to China. The same thing was to apply to lands taken by Japan from Russia. Korea was to become independent. There is no clear proof of this, but it may be assumed that the president expected that Japan would be occupied with an American zone of occupation in the central portion of the home islands. If we look at the world today, we can see that many of the hopes and decisions of the World War II leaders are determining today's borders. All the plans of the powers of the Tripartite Pact came to nothing. John was driven to Taiwan, and de Gaulle changed his policies. Stalin's empire retains many of the borders intended for it, but fell apart. Soon, the legitimacy it had acquired by successful defense against German aggression had failed. The worldwide empire in which Churchill had grown up and which remained his lodestar throughout the war has vanished. The same thing has happened to all the other colonial empires, with minimal exceptions. All this went forward more rapidly than the American president had anticipated. But he alone of the 8 leaders correctly anticipated the direction developments were likely to take. Since he was always an optimist, he would be less surprised today than the others. Thank you. The Germans, as I mentioned, agreed officially to the plan for the division of Asia and Russia that was communicated to them by the Tokyo government. On general details and issues, there was very little consultation and very major differences in concepts. In the literature, there is always, quite properly, heavy emphasis on the differences between the Brits and the Russians, us and the Brits, us and the Russians. But our relationship of the three major allies was harmony itself compared to the relationship between the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. It is worth noting, for example, that both the Italians and the Japanese kept urging Hitler to make a separate peace with Stalin and concentrate on crushing the British and Americans. The Germans had done that in the First World War. Why not do it again? And while there are clear signs that Stalin, well into 43, might have been interested in a separate peace with Hitler, Hitler was under no circumstances interested in such a thing. And so on that issue, there was total difference. There is another area where this, I think, is very interesting because of what then happened. As I'm sure you all know, in both world wars, Germany relied heavily on submarines to sink Allied merchant ships. The Germans tried very hard to persuade the Japanese to use their submarines to attack American and British and Dutch and so on merchant ships. And the Japanese declined. Their submarines were made to attack warships and were not to engage in commerce raiding. And they weren't that good at attacking warships. And ironically, in the latter part of the war, they were carrying supplies, the submarines, to cut off Japanese garrisons. And under those circumstances, what the Germans did was send submarines all the way around South Africa for a campaign in the Indian Ocean, and the Japanese provided them a base in Malaya. It was a ridiculously wasteful utilization of resources under circumstances where this really made very little sense, but it was the only way the Germans could make sure that there was a war against commerce in the Indian Ocean, on which the Japanese, of course, had the bases.
I'd like to inquire about the American entry into World War II. As we all remember, we reluctantly entered World War I at a late date, but our entry in World War I was evidently very important to winning the war. That being the case, there was, as I remember from being a child, that there was also a reluctance for us to enter World War II. Contrary to a few people that were sure that FDR actually engineered Pearl Harbor, I think that's never been proven beyond just a pipe dream. My question is, since America had no territorial ambitions in World War II, do you have any evidence that Hitler and/or Tojo and/or Mussolini wanted us to enter World War II, or were they reluctant for us to enter World War II?
Hitler had long planned to go to war with the United States and expected to do so after some other wars. But when, after the defeat of France, that did not immediately lead to the crushing of Britain, he suggested to the Japanese, why don't you go after the Brits now? And the Japanese told him, yes, we plan to do this in 1946. And then the question is, where did they pick that year? The Germans knew, under Titus McDuffie, the law for Philippine independence, to which I referred in my talk, the Philippines were to become independent in 1944, and the United States was to give up its bases there in 1946. In other words, the Japanese didn't want to go south with the Americans on their flank. It's under those circumstances that Hitler and also Mussolini promised Japan that if they went to war with the United States, as they would have to take the Philippines, they would go to war with the United States too. The Japanese went back and forth on this issue, and the Germans kept hoping that they would go. And the comparison that I also made in Jamestown earlier is, I think, very interesting. In December 41, the Germans were having trouble on the Eastern Front, and Hitler was very worried that the Japanese would see this as a good reason not to go to war. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had been devoting an enormous amount of time to the negotiations with the Japanese, hoping to stall them until they could see that a German victory was not certain. In this race between pushing him in and keeping him out, Hitler won by about a week, literally. If the Japanese had waited another week, they would have seen the German defeats on the Eastern Front and the British offensive in North Africa, that their idea that Germany was certain to win was wrong. But the enthusiasm was such that when Hitler, on the 7th of December, heard that Japan had attacked the United States, he was, because of the crisis on the Eastern Front around Moscow, but also in the north, particularly, he was not in Berlin, he was at the East Prussian military headquarters in Rostov. And it was going to take a few days to go through the diplomatic procedures, call the German parliament and give them the good news of war with the United States. And the idea of waiting for war with the United States for 2, 3, 4, perish forbid, 5 days. So on this day when he got the news of Pearl Harbor, he immediately sent instructions to the German Navy to start sinking ships of the United States and 8 other countries in the Western Hemisphere. He knew that the head of the German Navy had been calling for war with the United States since October 39, so he was quite sure that with this word they would do it. There is this degree of enthusiasm, and the sooner the better. Right? The other side of this, which I think tells you something about President Roosevelt, is not only that he had devoted an enormous amount of time to the negotiations with the Japanese. We tend to forget that presidents are issued 24 hours like the rest of us. There were 3 other European countries that, in addition to Germany and Italy, that declared war on the United States in December of 1941. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. President Roosevelt knew that Germany and Italy had submarines in the Atlantic that would obviously sink American ships. But why did Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria want to have a war with the United States? And what were they going to do to us? In a move for which I know of no history precedent, Roosevelt instructed the State Department to try to get those 3 countries to withdraw their declarations of war. And this was the State Department diplomats implemented Roosevelt's, or tried the procedure, in the capital of Turkey, which was neutral at the time. In Ankara, everybody from all sides had diplomats. So Roosevelt kept pushing and trying to get those three countries to withdraw their declarations of war. In June of 42, he gave up and sent a message to the Congress that these three absolutely insist they must have war with the United States. And we've tried to discourage them from this. And under these circumstances, the Congress will have to pass a resolution to the effect that there's a state of war between us and them. And the Congress did so. I think there's a very interesting way of insight into the thinking processes of Hitler and Roosevelt, the one who doesn't want to wait 3 or 4 days, and the one who waits for half a year. Other questions?
Given the Italian military's record of success in the early stages of the war, is it possible that anybody really believed that they were going to get that empire that you described that would include Egypt and Saudi Arabia and most of northern Africa, parts of Greece? Or was that just a charade to enlist his support?
Well, let's keep in mind that at the time we are talking about, in a war with the Ottoman Empire, Italy had acquired a big hunk. It had acquired some bits of Northeast Africa. It had fought a war and taken over Abyssinia, Ethiopia, whatever you want to call it. Under those circumstances, especially in alignment with a Germany that was clearly likely to win, they thought, this was a good chance to get a few more things in the Mediterranean. You keep in mind that in the summer of 1940, when France surrenders a piece of the southeast of France is under Italian occupation. They have, along with the Germans and Bulgarians and Hungarians, crushed Yugoslavia and taken over, in effect, substantial portions of it. They had earlier, before the war in April of 39, occupied and annexed Albania. There was, therefore, a sense that maybe this is a good time for us to pick up things. Italy, after all, had been on the Allied side in World War I. Now it's our chance to pick up things from our former allies. And so I'm not saying that everybody in Italy was enthusiastic and interested in favor of this. But we also need to remember that there was a major Italian participation alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front. And some of the heaviest casualties that Italians suffered in World War II were on the Eastern Front. And ironically, this in many ways contributed to Mussolini's fall, because families in Italy couldn't figure out what in the tweet is our son doing over there. If we're going to conquer a colonial empire, it ain't in Kazakhstan. It's in Africa. It's in the Middle East. And Mussolini's being voted out of power by the fascist Grand Council cannot be understood, I would suggest, without the substantial commitment of Italian forces and heavy losses to Italian forces on the Eastern Front as compared to North Africa, Northeast Africa.
Doctor, you had mentioned that other Axis powers were interested in trying to talk Hitler out of the conflict with Russia on the east, but Hitler remained adamant in not abandoning that pursuit. Was Hitler just that strong to continue dragging the rest of the Axis powers along with him? Were they too weak to abandon Hitler and not fight on the Eastern Front? Why did they not leave?
One of them tried very hard, two of them tried, both Hungary and Romania. The Germans occupied Hungary and the Russians occupied Romania. There were efforts to pull off, but it was too risky with an ally like the Germans to pull out of it. And Mussolini didn't think of the idea ever. The Japanese, as I don't have to tell you, continued fighting after the German unconditional surrender of May of 1945. And there was, for a time, unanimity in the Japanese Governing Council to accept 20 million casualties. That's every fourth person in the country. And it is also worth remembering that the Allies, because there had never been Japanese local surrenders, were worried about the post-Coronet, after we'd occupied all of Japan, after Olympic and Coronet, they would go on fighting in those places in China, in Southeast Asia, on the island. And in early 45, as they're talking about these things in Allied headquarters, Churchill is sending around a circular to his top military and civilian advisors, please not to talk in public about the likelihood of the war ending in 1948. Worth thinking about. Any other questions at this point?
Doctor, our final question before we conclude tonight. Thank you all again for coming out. As time continues to increase from us to the drawing of these borders, what do you believe is the most important thing we need to keep in mind post-World War II? What is the most valuable lesson we must continue to learn from these borders?
Well, that this was a war in which there was the effort by one country, in effect, to dominate and take over the world and restructure physically its population. And that it was the willingness and ability of the Allies to fight this and to coordinate their fighting that saved the world from this particular possibility. And that one needs to remember that others act on what they think. Not what you think, not what I think, but what they think. And that if you have people around who have the most what sound to most of us the most extraordinary ideas, we should remember that they will act on them. All invalids, all old disabled people on earth, all Jews on earth, all were to be killed, and all non-Germanic people, if not killed, were to be sterilized, so that after working for a while for the Germans, they could all be replaced with no progeny. Those are kind of extraordinary notions, it seems to me, but they were being fought for. And they would have affected this country as every other country on the face of the earth. And it would be well for people, I would suggest, to remember that things which would have seemed loony and inconceivable were in fact the real objectives towards which a major power was pushing, devoting enormous resources and taking significant steps. They were killing their own disabled World War I veterans, had finished that job, and had started killing their disabled World War II veterans. And ironically, the Allied victory saved the lives of tens of thousands of Germans whom their own government was going to have killed because they were disabled, old, had been badly wounded in air raids or at the front, and so on and so forth. It's in certain ways unbelievable and inconceivable, except the reality was this happened and was stopped. That is, it seems to me, a very important lesson to keep in mind from what was in world history the most costly war ever in terms of lives. Over 60 million.
Dr. Weinberg, thank you so much for your presentation here today. And today, thanks to Gerhard Peterson and all of those at the Robert H. Jackson Center for partnering us with this event. Thank you all for coming out.